Imagine walking through an airport dressed as a pilot, receiving first-class treatment, free flights, luxury hotels, and not even knowing how to fly a plane. He wasn't just a criminal. He was a ghost, slipping through the cracks of the FBI's most advanced investigations. One man, a teenage runaway, forged millions, outwitted banks, airlines, and even the U.S. government. A master of deception who didn't just break the law, he rewrote the rules. For years they chased him, but every time they got close, he was already gone. This is the real story of Frank Abagnale Jr., the man who outsmarted the FBI, one lie at a time. And the craziest part? They never saw him coming. Frank Abagnale Jr., the master imposter. Frank Abagnale Jr. is one of the most infamous con artists in history, a man whose charm, intelligence, and quick thinking allowed him to outwit the FBI for years. Born in 1948, Abagnale began his criminal career as a teenager, initially committing small-time check fraud before escalating his deception to a level few could imagine. By the time he was 21, he had successfully impersonated an airline pilot, a doctor, a lawyer, and even a college professor, cashing millions of dollars in fraudulent checks along the way. His ability to manipulate people and exploit weaknesses in systems made him nearly untouchable for years as he traveled across the United States and around the world, always staying one step ahead of law enforcement. Abagnale's most famous scam involved posing as a Pan Am pilot. Inspired by watching airline crews walk through airports with an aura of respect and admiration, he decided to acquire a uniform and fake credentials. With a little charm and a lot of confidence, he was able to convince airline personnel and hotel staff that he was a legitimate pilot. By deadheading, a practice where pilots hitch free rides on planes, he managed to fly over 1 million miles for free. More than just a means of travel, this identity gave him access to high-end hotels, expensive meals, and endless networking opportunities that furthered his scams. The FBI struggled to track him because his crimes were committed in multiple jurisdictions, and he often disappeared before authorities could even begin to piece together his trail. Not satisfied with just one identity, Abagnale took on several more personas, each more audacious than the last. Using his skills in forgery, he crafted a Harvard Law School transcript and passed the Louisiana bar exam after studying for just a few weeks. He was then hired by the Louisiana Attorney General's office, where he worked undetected for months. His confidence and natural ability to blend in made him a master of deception. When he decided to pose as a pediatrician in Georgia, he talked his way into a job supervising medical interns at a hospital. Though he had no formal medical training, he managed to avoid suspicion by delegating most of his work to the interns, who assumed he was a qualified doctor. As the FBI started closing in on him, Abagnale's ability to escape capture became legendary. At one point, he was arrested in France, but his reputation as a master manipulator preceded him. He was eventually extradited to Sweden and later sent back to the United States, where he managed to escape from federal custody by posing as an undercover prison inspector. By convincing guards that he was part of a secret FBI investigation, he simply walked out of the detention center without resistance. Even after he was caught again, he attempted yet another escape by convincing prison officials that he was actually a prison inspector sent to evaluate security. Despite his extraordinary ability to deceive, his luck eventually ran out. After being arrested and sentenced to 12 years in prison, he was offered a deal by the FBI. Recognizing his unparalleled skills in forgery and deception, they agreed to commute his sentence in exchange for his assistance in identifying and preventing fraud. Abagnale accepted the offer and went on to work for the U.S. government, helping law enforcement agencies catch criminals who used the same tactics he once employed. In the years that followed, Abagnale transformed his life completely. He became a security consultant, working with major corporations and banks to develop fraud prevention measures. He wrote books on identity theft and fraud detection and became a sought-after speaker on the subject. His story became so famous that it was turned into the Hollywood film Catch Me If You Can, starring Leonardo DiCaprio as Abagnale and Tom Hanks as the determined FBI agent who spent years pursuing him. What makes Abagnale's story so fascinating is not just the sheer audacity of his crimes, but the way he used his intelligence and charisma to manipulate even the most skeptical authorities. His ability to adapt to any situation and make people believe whatever he wanted them to believe was his greatest weapon. He didn't use violence or intimidation. He simply exploited people's trust. His case remains one of the most remarkable examples of social engineering and psychological manipulation in criminal history. D.B. Cooper, the Unsolved Mystery. D.B. Cooper remains one of the greatest enigmas in American criminal history. On November 24, 1971, a man identifying himself as Dan Cooper boarded Northwest Orient Airlines Flight 305 in Portland, Oregon, bound for Seattle. He was described as a quiet, well-dressed man in his mid-40s, wearing a dark suit, black tie, and a neatly pressed white shirt. He carried a briefcase and a paper bag, appearing no different from any other business traveler. However, as soon as the flight took off, he would execute one of the boldest and most mysterious crimes in aviation history, managing to outsmart the FBI and disappear without a trace. Shortly after takeoff, Cooper handed a note to a flight attendant, Florence Schaffner, initially dismissing it as just another flirtatious passenger. She pocketed it without reading. But Cooper leaned in and whispered, "Miss, you'd better read that note. I have a bomb." The note contained his demands: $200,000 in cash, 4 parachutes, and a fuel truck standing by in Seattle to refuel the plane. Schaffner, now realizing the seriousness of the situation, immediately alerted the cockpit crew. The airline and authorities, fearing for the safety of the passengers, quickly complied. For the next few hours, Cooper remained calm, even polite. He ordered a bourbon and soda, paid for his drink, and displayed no nervousness. When the plane landed in Seattle, the authorities delivered his ransom money and parachutes as requested, while Cooper allowed all 36 passengers to leave the aircraft. He kept only the flight crew on board and demanded they take off again, heading toward Mexico City at a low altitude and slow speed. He insisted the rear staircase of the Boeing 727 remain deployable during the flight. As the aircraft flew over the rugged terrain of southwestern Washington, somewhere between Seattle and Reno, Cooper did the unthinkable. He parachuted out of the back of the plane into the cold and pitch-black night, with nothing but the ransom money and the clothes on his back. When the plane finally landed in Reno, the FBI found the rear staircase open and Cooper was gone. A massive manhunt ensued, covering thousands of square miles of wilderness, yet not a single trace of him was found. No body, no parachute, no personal belongings. The FBI launched one of the most extensive investigations in its history, interviewing hundreds of people and following thousands of leads. But Cooper remained an elusive ghost. The money he stole, marked bills, was never circulated, leading some to speculate he might not have survived the jump. However, in 1980, a young boy discovered a decayed bundle of $20 bills buried along the Columbia River, matching the serial numbers of the ransom money. This discovery only deepened the mystery, raising more questions than answers. Over the decades, many theories have emerged about Cooper's fate. Some believe he perished in the wilderness, unable to survive the harsh conditions of the mountainous terrain. Others argue he was an experienced paratrooper who planned the escape meticulously and lived under a new identity. Various suspects have been considered, including former military personnel and criminal masterminds, but no concrete evidence has ever linked anyone to the crime. The FBI pursued the case for 45 years before officially closing it in 2016, leaving it one of the most enduring mysteries in American history. What made Cooper so remarkable was not just his daring escape, but his ability to remain undetected. Unlike other criminals who left behind traces of their crimes, Cooper simply vanished. He executed his plan with surgical precision, avoiding violence and leaving authorities with nothing but speculation. His crime captivated the public imagination, inspiring books, movies, and endless debates among amateur sleuths and investigators. Whether he survived or perished that night, D.B. Cooper's legend remains intact, an elusive mastermind who outsmarted the FBI and disappeared into the annals of history. Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber. Ted Kaczynski, better known as the Unabomber, waged a nearly two-decade-long campaign of domestic terrorism against what he saw as the evils of modern industrial society. A mathematical prodigy turned reclusive extremist, Kaczynski managed to outsmart the FBI for years through meticulous planning, cryptic messaging, and an unparalleled ability to disappear off the grid. His methods were calculated, his attacks precise, and his ability to evade capture made him one of the most elusive criminals in American history. Kaczynski's descent into infamy began in 1978, when he sent his first homemade bomb to a professor at Northwestern University. The device exploded, causing minor injuries, but it was just the beginning. Over the next 17 years, he orchestrated a series of increasingly sophisticated bombings, targeting universities, airlines, and corporate executives. Each of his bombs was handcrafted, built with extreme care to leave minimal forensic evidence. He made sure to use materials that were difficult to trace, including wooden components and hand-carved metal parts, leaving no fingerprints, DNA, or identifiable signatures behind. His ability to remain anonymous frustrated law enforcement and gave rise to his nickname, Unabomber, short for University and Airline Bomber. Unlike most criminals, Kaczynski had no financial motives. His bombings were not acts of revenge or personal vendettas, but part of a broader ideological crusade against technology and industrialization. He believed that modern society was corrupting humanity, enslaving people under a system of control and dependence on machines. His manifesto, titled Industrial Society and Its Future, was a lengthy philosophical treatise outlining his belief that technological progress was eroding human freedom and that violent resistance was necessary to stop it. For years, the FBI struggled to find any solid leads. Kaczynski lived in a small, self-built cabin in rural Montana, completely off the grid, without electricity or running water. He had no driver's license, no vehicle, and no apparent connections to the modern world. He carefully selected his targets and mailed his bombs from different locations, never staying in one place for long. Investigators followed thousands of leads, but the Unabomber always seemed to be one step ahead, adapting his methods to evade capture. The turning point in the case came in 1995 when Kaczynski sent his manifesto to major newspapers, offering to cease his attacks if they published his work in full. The FBI reluctantly agreed, hoping that someone might recognize his writing. That decision ultimately led to his downfall. Kaczynski's brother, David, read the manifesto and noticed striking similarities between the Unabomber's rhetoric and the writings Ted had shared with him in the past. Suspicious, he alerted the FBI, who began investigating Ted Kaczynski as a suspect. After carefully building their case, authorities finally raided Kaczynski's remote Montana cabin in April 1996. Inside, they found a shocking amount of evidence: detailed journals documenting his bomb-making process, rough drafts of his manifesto, and even live, undetonated bombs ready to be sent to new victims. With overwhelming proof against him, Kaczynski was arrested and later sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Ted Kaczynski had outsmarted the FBI for nearly 2 decades, not through brute force, but through intellect, discipline, and an understanding of how to manipulate the system. His ability to live completely off the grid made him nearly invisible to authorities, and his meticulous approach to building bombs made forensic investigation nearly impossible. Even in his eventual capture, it wasn't traditional law enforcement methods that led to his downfall, but rather his own arrogance, believing that his ideas were so important that they needed to be published for the world to see. Despite his capture, Kaczynski's story continues to captivate the public. His manifesto remains a widely discussed document, and his case is studied by criminologists, psychologists, and law enforcement experts as an example of how a single, highly intelligent individual can evade authorities for years. The Unabomber case remains one of the longest and most expensive manhunts in FBI history, proving that even the most powerful investigative agency in the world can struggle when faced with a criminal genius operating on their own terms. James Whitey Bulger, the Ghost of Boston. James Whitey Bulger was one of the most notorious and elusive criminals in American history, a mob boss who manipulated the FBI while running a violent criminal empire in Boston. For decades, he controlled the city's underworld, engaging in extortion, drug trafficking, and murder, all while managing to outmaneuver law enforcement. His cunning use of informant status, combined with his ability to disappear without a trace, allowed him to evade capture for 16 years, making him one of the FBI's most wanted fugitives. Bulger's rise to power began in the 1970s when he took control of the Winter Hill Gang, a powerful Irish-American criminal organization. Unlike many mobsters who relied solely on brute force, Bulger played a much more strategic game. He built alliances, eliminated rivals with ruthless efficiency, and, most critically, managed to infiltrate law enforcement itself. In the late 1970s, he secretly became an FBI informant, feeding agents information about his enemies in the Italian mafia. This arrangement was not made out of loyalty to law enforcement, but as a calculated move to eliminate competition while keeping himself protected. His FBI handler, Special Agent John Connolly, had grown up in the same South Boston neighborhood as Bulger and admired him. Bulger exploited this connection to ensure that the FBI turned a blind eye to his own crimes. Whenever law enforcement agencies attempted to investigate him, Connolly would tip him off, allowing him to stay ahead of any charges. This corrupt relationship enabled Bulger to continue his reign of terror for years, as he orchestrated murders, extorted businesses, and expanded his influence without fear of arrest. However, in the early 1990s, the arrangement began to unravel. As the Justice Department intensified its crackdown on organized crime, Bulger's FBI protection started to crumble. His own criminal activities had become too blatant to ignore, and federal prosecutors began building a case against him. In 1994, learning that an indictment was imminent, Bulger once again demonstrated his ability to outmaneuver law enforcement. With a tip-off from Connolly, he vanished from Boston just days before he was to be arrested. For the next 16 years, he remained completely off the grid. Unlike other fugitives who relied on their criminal networks, Bulger and his longtime girlfriend, Catherine Gregg, lived an extraordinarily low-profile life. They traveled across the country, eventually settling in Santa Monica, California, where they posed as an elderly retired couple under fake identities. Bulger abandoned the flashy lifestyle of a mob boss and instead blended into the background, spending his days walking along the beach, reading history books, and collecting Social Security checks under an alias. His ability to live unnoticed for so long was a testament to his discipline and intelligence. Despite years of searching, the FBI struggled to find any credible leads. There were rumored sightings across the country and even abroad, but Bulger always seemed to be one step ahead. The breakthrough finally came in 2011 when the FBI launched a nationwide publicity campaign focusing on Gregg rather than Bulger himself. By publicizing details about her habits, the authorities hoped someone would recognize her instead. The strategy worked. An anonymous tip led them to a rent-controlled apartment in Santa Monica, where they arrested the aging mobster without resistance. When agents searched his apartment, they found over $800,000 in cash, multiple weapons, and dozens of fake IDs, proof that Bulger had been prepared to disappear again if necessary. However, his luck had finally run out. In 2013, he was convicted on multiple charges, including 11 murders, and sentenced to life in prison. Even in captivity, his violent reputation followed him. He was brutally murdered by fellow inmates in 2018, ending the life of a man who had spent decades outsmarting both the law and his enemies. Whitey Bulger's ability to manipulate the FBI and evade capture for so long makes him one of the most remarkable criminal masterminds in history. His story is a chilling example of how corruption within law enforcement can allow criminals to thrive, and how even the most elusive fugitives can eventually be caught. For years he was a ghost, operating in the shadows, always a step ahead. But in the end, justice caught up with him, proving that even the most cunning criminals can't run forever. Richard Lee McNair, the escape artist. Richard Lee McNair earned a reputation as one of the most ingenious prison escape artists in modern history. A convicted murderer serving a life sentence without parole, McNair didn't just escape once. He broke out of custody 3 times, each time using intelligence, manipulation, and an uncanny ability to talk his way out of trouble. Unlike most fugitives who rely on brute force or chaos to escape, McNair's methods were precise, calculated, and executed with an almost theatrical level of confidence. His ability to repeatedly outsmart law enforcement, including the FBI, made him one of the most frustrating fugitives to track down. McNair's criminal career began in 1987 when he was arrested for the murder of a man during a botched robbery in North Dakota. While in police custody at a local jail, he made his first escape attempt by using lip balm to slip out of his handcuffs. He was quickly recaptured, but showed early signs of his exceptional ability to exploit small weaknesses in the system. His second escape was far more impressive. In 1992, McNair was serving a life sentence at the North Dakota State Penitentiary when he found a way to break out. Using materials he obtained while working in the prison's workshop, he managed to force open a ventilation duct and crawl through it to freedom. His escape sparked a massive manhunt, but McNair managed to stay ahead of authorities for several months before being caught in Grand Island, Nebraska. This time he was transferred to a high-security federal prison in Louisiana, where officials believed he would never escape again. They underestimated him. In April 2006, McNair pulled off his most daring and brilliant escape yet. While working in a prison warehouse, he meticulously crafted an escape plan that relied on patience and precision. He constructed a makeshift escape pod by modifying a mailbag and hiding inside a stack of shrink-wrapped pallets. At the end of his shift, prison staff unknowingly transported him out of the facility, believing he was just another package being shipped out. Once outside, McNair calmly freed himself and walked away. By the time prison officials realized he was missing, he had already disappeared into the world. His escape led to a nationwide manhunt, with the FBI and U.S. Marshals tracking him as he moved across the country. Yet, despite the overwhelming resources dedicated to finding him, McNair repeatedly outwitted authorities. His ability to change identities, blend into different environments, and manipulate those he encountered allowed him to avoid capture for more than a year. One of the most legendary moments of his time on the run occurred in October 2006, when a police officer in Ball, Louisiana, unknowingly pulled over McNair for questioning. With his calm demeanor and quick thinking, McNair managed to convince the officer that he was simply a jogger out for a run. Their conversation, which was recorded on the officer's dash cam, later became famous for the way McNair nonchalantly lied his way out of custody. After a few minutes of casual conversation, the officer let him go, not realizing that he had just come face to face with one of the FBI's most wanted fugitives. McNair continued to evade capture for another year, traveling through Canada and staying under the radar by using fake identities and altering his appearance. However, in 2007, his luck finally ran out. A vigilant RCMP officer in Campbellton, New Brunswick, recognized him from a wanted poster and arrested him without incident. After his capture, he was extradited back to the United States and placed in the highest level of security confinement, ensuring that he would never escape again. McNair's story remains one of the most fascinating cases of a fugitive repeatedly outsmarting law enforcement. His ability to manipulate people, exploit security weaknesses, and remain composed under pressure made him a master escape artist. While he ultimately couldn't outrun the law forever, his legendary escapes and effortless deception proved that sometimes the most dangerous criminals are not the ones with weapons, but the ones with intelligence, patience, and an uncanny ability to disappear. Robert Hanssen, the double agent. Robert Hanssen was one of the most damaging spies in American history, a man who lived a double life as both a high-ranking FBI agent and a secret informant for the Soviet Union and later Russia. For over 2 decades, he operated undetected within the very agency responsible for catching spies, methodically feeding classified information to America's Cold War adversary. His betrayal caused irreparable damage to U.S. intelligence operations, leading to the deaths of American assets abroad, yet for years, he remained invisible to the FBI's counterintelligence efforts. His ability to manipulate, deceive, and hide in plain sight made him one of the most elusive criminals the agency ever pursued. Hanssen joined the FBI in 1976, assigned to counterintelligence operations, giving him access to some of the most sensitive information in U.S. national security. His disillusionment with the government, combined with financial troubles, led him to betray his country. In 1979, he made his first contact with Soviet intelligence, offering classified information in exchange for money. Unlike other spies who were reckless or motivated by ideology, Hanssen was methodical, patient, and highly disciplined. He didn't chase lavish lifestyles or extravagant spending that might raise suspicion. Instead, he lived a modest existence, carefully covering his tracks and avoiding the flashy mistakes that had exposed other traitors. Hanssen's tradecraft was nearly flawless. He never met his Soviet handlers in person, instead using dead drops, leaving classified documents in secluded locations for Russian agents to pick up. To communicate, he relied on coded messages, encrypted notes, and even the placement of tape on specific public locations to indicate when a drop had been made. He refused to use electronic communication, understanding that digital footprints could be traced. Even his payments were handled discreetly, receiving cash and diamonds rather than wire transfers that might raise red flags. Over the years, he provided Soviet and Russian intelligence with thousands of classified documents, revealing U.S. nuclear strategies, surveillance tactics, and the identities of American spies working overseas. His leaks led to the capture and execution of multiple U.S. informants, making him responsible for some of the most devastating intelligence breaches in American history. All the while, he continued working as an FBI agent, even overseeing counterintelligence efforts against Russian espionage, allowing him to monitor investigations that might expose him. For years, the FBI had no clue that one of their own was the mole responsible for intelligence leaks. Hanssen had successfully evaded detection by keeping his activities compartmentalized and maintaining a routine that never raised alarms. When the FBI started suspecting a mole in their ranks, they initially looked elsewhere, conducting investigations that failed to identify him. His ability to blend in and manipulate those around him made him the perfect double agent. His downfall came in the late 1990s when U.S. intelligence, determined to find the mole, turned to a desperate solution: buying information from a Russian source. In a risky exchange, the FBI obtained a secret file from Russian intelligence that contained documents from their American informant. The handwriting, style, and tradecraft pointed directly to Hansen. Once he became a prime suspect, the FBI launched an extensive surveillance operation against him, monitoring his movements and communications. In February 2001, Hansen was finally caught in the act. The FBI arrested him in a Virginia park while he was making one of his signature dead drops, leaving a package of classified documents for his Russian handlers. His capture marked the end of one of the most damaging espionage operations in U.S. history. He later pleaded guilty to 15 counts of espionage in exchange for avoiding the death penalty and was sentenced to life in prison without parole. What made Hansen particularly dangerous was not just his access to classified intelligence, but his ability to manipulate the very agency tasked with catching spies. He had worked within the FBI for decades, knew how investigations operated, and understood exactly how to avoid suspicion. His methodical approach, lack of ostentatious behavior, and deep understanding of counterintelligence tactics made him one of the most effective and longest-running spies in modern history. His story serves as a chilling reminder that sometimes the most dangerous threats come from within. The FBI spent years searching for a mole who was sitting right in front of them, attending meetings, leading investigations, and even warning others about the dangers of espionage. Hansen's betrayal was one of the greatest intelligence failures in American history, proving that even the most sophisticated agencies can be blindsided when an enemy is hiding in plain sight.